I think there's something about the newness of our faith and the Americanness of our faith that gets into journalists' heads. They seem to feel like we are an American institution, and so they can criticize our religious practices in order to get them to change.
Hey guys, welcome back to Saints Unscripted. My name is Cam, and our guest today is an old friend, C.D. Cunningham. He is the founder of Public Square Magazine. He's been on the show a couple times. Today we are talking about what?
We're talking about Twitter.
Okay.
And
always a great place to start.
The Church of Jesus Christ and how journalists have treated them differently. It's so great to be back here.
Yeah.
I think is this the third or fourth set I've been on now? It's fun. What a nice new
keeps
set.
Changing.
Yeah. Now we don't have a bar or anything, so I think this is
comfortable.
Your guest's first introduction to my legs, even my torso. So this is the first time you guys. I do. Yeah. So anyway, but nice to be back.
Okay, Twitter, formerly known as X.
Oh, vice versa.
X, formerly known as Twitter. Still can't get that straight. Clearly,
you're not the only one.
You're right, and this is the problem.
Yeah, part of what I do with my work with Public Square Magazine is I am our media critic.
Okay,
and so media critic is, I guess, a fancy way of saying complaining about journalists.
This is a little meta. A journalist talking about other journalists.
It is a little bit meta. Right. Yeah. That's kind of what you are. Is you're kind of talking to people about this thing that mostly avoids media criticism because they're not criticizing themselves. And so they tend to be a little bit outside of their own realm, despite the fact that they are very influential on what's going on.
Why do you think that's necessary? Is there any other organization that keeps journalists in check? Is there?
There's certainly a handful. I'm far from the only media critic, but yeah, that's kind of our role. And so Public Square Magazine focuses on Latter-day Saints and what we're seeing in the world. And so my media criticism tends to focus on how are journalists treating the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and members of the church. And is it fair? Are we missing things? What's different or unique? And so when Twitter changed its name to X, it immediately reminded me of what happened several years before that, of when President Nelson announced that we were asking outsiders, and of course members of the church as well, to refer to the whole name of the church. And he introduced a new nickname, the Church of Jesus Christ, which had never really been used previously. We also took some real big steps to actually change names of organizations, like the Tabernacle Choir is no longer the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. Even nicknames like LDS were dropped for the first time.
ComeUntoChrist.org.
ComeUntoChrist.org instead of Mormon.org. But like LDS Family Services went away, a different name. And so while I guess the church was always the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this name change or this name announcement did have many real name changes. And so I was curious of my work to see how have journalists treated the name change of the church versus the name change of Twitter.
They're the funnel that disseminates church information to those that are not members.
Absolutely.
They're the front lines.
They shape public perception.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what was your finding?
So what's been interesting is, and any of your readers who read any news will immediately recognize the phrase X, formerly known as Twitter. Yeah, journalists rely on Twitter and X probably more than is reasonable. This is a criticism that a lot of media critics have had about journalists. But because of that, when this name change happened, they needed something, right? And so that was the phrase that they immediately landed on was X, formerly known as Twitter. And that's effective, right? You want to be able to communicate to your audience in a way that they understand what you're talking about, right? And so if you say X and it's a pretty recent change, no one's going to know.
But now it's been long enough.
And then you also want to kind of connect that with the history, right? So that if you have criticisms of Twitter, X isn't just kind of avoiding those because they changed the name. So saying formerly known as Twitter kind of connects that.
Right.
And it's been only a few years, or not even a few years, less than a year now, that the change is made. So I think it makes a lot of sense that journalists are using that. But what's interesting about that phrase is that for the church, there's a very similar phrase that journalists fell into. They will say in the first mention, the Associated Press Style Guide says to use the church's full name in its first mention. So they'll say the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, widely known as the Mormon Church. And so what was interesting to me in looking at this and noticing this difference is that this is two different phrases describing basically the same thing. One is formerly known as or formerly referred to as, and the other one is widely known as.
Right.
So what the journalists were doing is they're asserting that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is known as the Mormon Church right now. X is no longer known as Twitter.
Right. And I remember Elon Musk being very adamant and getting somewhat upset that people were still referring to it as Twitter. Because he was so passionate about calling it X. And it's interesting to me that he has the pull.
Yeah.
And people are, I don't know, afraid or respect him enough that they're willing to make that transition, but not as much with the church.
Well, it's just for accuracy, right? The name of X is X. And so you're also not doing it just in the same way that you want to connect it to Twitter so that people know. If you call it Twitter in a journalism article, that's wrong. It's not called that anymore.
Right.
So I thought this was interesting that journalists were asserting that it's still, and some people will be like, well, yeah, but people do still call the Church of Jesus Christ the Mormon Church.
Right.
So that's accurate.
Right.
But people still call X Twitter. So to say formerly known as is also untrue.
Right.
And yet they're happy to do it because they've said this is their old name.
Right.
And so they're happy to kind of.
Do you think it's fully comparable because the church has never been our official name?
Yeah.
Right. So it's a little bit different there. We can't really say formerly known as the Mormon Church because we've never been known as the Mormon Church.
In fact, Time magazine, in one of their very first articles that included this phrase, they used that phrase, formerly known as the Mormon Church, and they actually issued a correction. And they took that phrase out and they used the widely known as to say we mischaracterized this as saying formerly known as the Mormon Church. And I reached out to them. They never got back to me.
Of course.
But I assume that it's exactly what you say. To say formerly known as kind of suggests, oh, this used to be their official name, which wouldn't be accurate.
What word would you use instead?
Formerly referred to.
Referred to as.
Yeah, formerly referred to as the Mormon
That
Church.
makes sense.
And I think that's the same as, and people are like, well, you can't say formerly, but formerly referred to as Twitter. Also, you can't say formerly, but they do, right? And some people are like, well, you're comparing apples and oranges, right? That for the reason you said, but that doesn't make it better.
No.
This has been our official name for 200 years, and yet they weren't doing it, right? That's almost like, oh, like, why has this persisted so long?
Right.
A couple of years after the change, I had done a pretty big study where we did sentiment analysis. And so we were saying, okay, this article, what name does it use to refer to the church? And is it a positive or negative story? And we weren't really like analyzing if it was positive or negative or fair or not fair. We were just like, if it's a negative story, it's negative. If it's a positive story, it's positive, right? Is it the church donated or is it a member of the church had some legal problem, right? It's pretty clear if it's a positive or negative story. Right. And then what name did they use? And what we found is that when journalists use the name Mormon to refer to the church, overwhelmingly, it has a negative sentiment.
Interesting.
And when they don't use the name of the church,
it's neutral.
It's much more neutral. Yeah. Which I think was a really interesting finding. And I think now when we're like, why are they struggling to give it up? I mean, now we're psychoanalyzing journalists. And I think a lot of journalists probably aren't thinking that hard about why they use one phrase versus the other. But I have to think that that's part of it, is that there is some of these baked in negative assumptions that are connected with the phrase Mormon Church in their mind. And so for them, they're like, well, we have to let our readers know that this is the same group that we don't like.
Right. Are there other institutes of religion that are having the same issue where like people are saying you can't compare Twitter to the church, but can you compare one church to another church?
Name changes of churches are not that common.
Okay.
I would say it's certainly not unique, but there aren't a lot of groups who are dealing with this. There's certainly some,
I know
the
you mentioned the
Shakers.
Seventh-day Adventists in one of your articles.
Oh, yeah.
They've never had this issue. Like people just
Well, that's right. I laugh at people like a professional acquaintance of mine, probably the leading journalist on the church, is a gal named Peggy Fletcher Stack. And she has had, she won't like this description, but I think it's good. She's had a little bit of a tantrum about this name change, and she's made her demands of everything that it has to list. It has to be one word, and it has to be short, and it has to be easily recognizable. And I'm like, come on, Peggy, like Seventh-day Adventist, like you never had that for that.
just rolls off the tongue.
Yeah, and she's like, but to refer to the culture, like we can't say the culture of the Church of Jesus Christ. That's ridiculous. And I'm like, how about Baptists? Like, yeah, I know you loved Mormonism, but there's never been a Baptistism. Like, come on, Peggy. Like,
stay consistent.
Yeah, yeah, I know you don't like it. I know your life was easy before, but this is not an unreasonable request. Right. I mean, let me be clear. I don't object to journalists talking about the church and saying, formerly known or formerly referred to as the Mormon Church, or because you do want to include that context, and that is a name that is widely used for people to understand who we are. But there are other nicknames that can be used for, like, one of the big complaints you get about it is, oh, it's so long. But it was said the Church of Jesus Christ is as short as anything, but we don't want to use it. We're like, oh, but no, there's other groups that use that name. Well, we've never had that problem with Mormons. There's lots of other groups that use that name. Yeah, it's kind of like no. We get to define you. We will stop calling you Mormon when we decide to stop calling you Mormon. I think there's something about the newness of our faith and the Americanness of our faith that gets into journalists' heads and makes them feel like they have some say-so about our faith. You think about like the coverage in Mitt Romney's presidential run of how many journalists wrote about our underwear.
Yeah, that's a little
weird.
That's weird.
Right? And we see that in other things, right? We were joking beforehand about Rolling Stone, which is a major national U.S. publication, who decided they could write an entire article about what they described as unverified rumors about that BYU students were having armpit sex. Who else gets this treatment? There's outsiders, right, who do practices that we think are really weird.
But
right, Jains do things that our culture would think is weird. Muslims do things our culture would think is weird. And yet, because they are foreign to our culture, we give them,
or more well established. They've been around
a
lot longer. Right.
We give them a sense of kind of respect and deference. Oh, this is their religion. We say, hey, we may not get it, but this is part of your worldview.
Right.
And they aren't necessarily willing to give Latter-day Saints that same. They seem to feel like we are an American institution, and so they can criticize our religious practices in order to get them to change. And I mean, they've had some success. If you look at the history of this, right, like the Utah War was very much that's a result of New York Times journalists deciding that they're going to make polygamy into look like a licentious thing that the people practicing it didn't think it was. And it resulted in real damage. And I certainly wouldn't want to compare that with people saying widely known as opposed to formerly referred to as, but these decisions that they make, they do affect it. And it's their way of saying you are under our control in a way that they just would never say about other religious groups.
And members of the church tend to be a very passive, understanding group. And I think one of your articles said something like we've accepted our place at the bottom of the social totem pole, right?
Sure. McKay Coppins had a wonderful Atlantic article where he's a leading journalist and a Latter-day Saint, one of the few. And yeah, he kind of talks about that interesting experience.
Do you think this is something that ordinary members of the church could push back on more so than just correcting people when they misuse the name of the church? Do you think more people need to get involved? Like, you're already obviously on the front lines with your job as a media critic.
Yeah.
But what can an average everyday member of the church do to help this? Or should they?
One thing that happens a lot with members of minority groups like the church is that they will want to gain favor from the in-group. And so they do that by signaling that they share the values and go back to just distancing themselves from the group that they're in. And we've seen this in minority groups a lot, right? Nazi Germany, right? You'd have the good Jew kind of effect that, oh, well, I'm not like them, right? Latter-day Saints have a similar phenomenon, obviously not with the same stakes, where you will have people dismiss these pretty obvious critiques by saying it's just a persecution complex. I'm sure you've heard this phrase before leveled at members of the church. And let's be clear, these issues that we're talking about are not life and death.
No.
Right? These aren't massive issues, and yet they are real.
But neither is X versus Twitter.
Neither is X versus Twitter.
We take that seriously.
Yeah. But they are real. And so when members of the church are signaling to the outgroup that no, you don't have to listen to these concerns, those are just those people who care too much, they are giving permission to them to continue by saying, well, good Mormons don't care about these things.
Right.
The Mormons that our
cool
culture
Mormons,
care. Exactly. So I think the first thing I would say to Latter-day Saints to change is knock that off, right? That the little bit of pottage that you get, the cultural cachet you get by selling out members of the church isn't worth it. And it makes the situation worse. Don't overreact, I think. Like you said, calling out. There was kind of a little bit of a moment where there are a lot of people overreacting, correcting people all the time. Right. Or you'll even see some people still who this is their, their hill that they're dying on is I use Quora, or I used to. It's kind of gone downhill, but and people would ask questions about the Mormon church, and you'd get members of the church being like, I don't know what you're talking about. What's the Mormon church? I'm like, I think you do know what they're talking about. So yeah, I don't think that's helpful, but I do think that there is a place for reasoned response. And I think if you see journalists doing this kind of thing, especially ones within your circle of influence or local newspaper, I think we take for granted how influential. Not take for granted. I think we dismiss how influential local newspapers are. That a lot of the big national publications are being influenced by that. And your local newspaper journalist
pull directly and put them on their site. Yeah. Your
local newspaper journalist is pretty accessible to you. Not super. I mean, they're getting a lot of things from a lot of people.
Right. But you can send an email. And be respectful. These are professionals. And even though we've kind of identified that there's probably some unconscious biases at play, they don't hate you. They don't hate the church. They see their job truly in terms of informing people. Right.
And we can inform people better by using the same type of language in both situations.
Who produces the AP style guide? Is that a church influence thing, or do they do it internally?
There's an organization called the Associated Press.
Right.
And they create their style guide.
Okay.
So the Associated Press is an organization that prints they try to do really neutral stuff. They have their own biases, but they're pretty good.
Better than most.
Them and Reuters are pretty good. And it's just kind of news reports, basically. And everyone will pick them up when it's relevant to their newspaper. And so they have their style guide, and it's been widely accepted by journalists. So it becomes a thing, and it's updated regularly.
So don't be a pushover, but be nice about it.
Absolutely.
Right. Like everything in today's world.
And pick your places, I would say.
Yeah. And not everything has to be a fight.
Yeah.
And it's only, I mean, the name of the church, it's been what, 2 years?
No, it's been longer than that now. Yeah, it was pre-COVID. I know. 5 years. Yeah, 5 years sounds right. I want to say it was
COVID
October.
Was 6 months ago, right?
I think it was October 2018.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, that this request was made. It's been long enough, and the changes have been persistent enough that I think it's worth taking another moment to say, okay, in the initial days, it was like, oh, is this just a request?
It's been
but there's been real big changes made. Right. The church clearly is invested in asking us to focus on the name of Jesus Christ. the revealed name. And I think by saying Jesus Christ every time we talk about the church, it focuses our minds in a meaningful religious way.
Absolutely.
And I think they have the right to use their name to help people think about Jesus
Savior.
Christ.
Right.
And we should be respectful of that. Oh, an idea came to me. The nickname, the Church of Jesus Christ, that was suggested hasn't taken off really in any quarters, even among Latter-day Saints, because it's new.
Right.
And yet it's pithy, it's effective. You basically know what they're talking about because it's a shortened name of the existing name. There are other groups who use it, but they are pretty small.
Right.
And so without being disrespectful to them, you would obviously want to clarify in a larger conversation or article. But if Latter-day Saints started using that as their shortened version of the church,
and it's a natural conversation starter.
I think it would be really helpful in helping that nickname, because the big problem that journalists have is headlines.
Right.
They don't know what to put. And so Mormon Church is it has continued to be the main headline thing. And if we could make it so that the Church of Jesus Christ as a headline, as a go-to and a headline, I think would make a big difference in helping this continual process.
Wow.
So I think that's something that just regular members of the church could do, is when you need a short version, the Church of Jesus Christ. It's short.
Awesome.
It's easy. It was so nice to be here, Cam. Links to Public Square should be there. I sent several articles that kind of talk about this and other media criticism stuff of the church. And then the report we talked about today about Twitter will have a link in the description.
As a local journalist?
Am I accessible? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. You can get me at C. Cunningham at Public Square Mag. Happy to chat with people there.
Perfect.
And
and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Cam.
Thanks for tuning in.